posted. I guess I believe we're recording now. So the link to this recording is going to be posted to University of Maryland Extension's Woodland Stewardship Education YouTube page. So Brad, if you don't mind putting that YouTube link in the chat, you all will be able to have access to this recording as time goes on. It'll just be up there, so you don't have to register or anything, and you'll be able to use it for your own devices here. And then I also wanted to mention the invitation to self-identify. So because we are, or I work for Extension, we want to make sure that our programming is available to and reaches everyone around the state. And so I'm putting out a poll now that I would love for you all to fill out. Basically, so you should see it up on your screen now. This poll just makes sure that we are reaching audiences that are representative of the state of Maryland, and then we can use that information to sort of future guide our programming if we're not sort of reaching the audiences that we need to be. So great. So that all is good to go. Now, I don't want to take up too much time for me. Brad, it looks like you're off mute.
Yep, I just wanted to remind people that once they complete the polling question and submit it, that window will close.
Perfect. Thank you. Brad's awesome, so huge ups to him for helping me out here today. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I just wanted to talk a little bit about who I am because I'm new to this position. I started in March. I'm an extension faculty member with the University of Maryland. And my programmatic focus is on forestry and natural resources. And sort of what led me to this point is about 10 years of working in education and natural resources. I most recently completed my PhD up at the University of Vermont, doing research on forest management in the Northeast. I went to Virginia Tech to get a master's degree. This was before that, and I did work on environmental education. So I sort of evaluated programs to understand what made them work well. And then I did my undergraduate degree at St. Mary's College of Maryland, close by to where I grew up in Leonardtown. So I'm a product of two land-grant universities and a public liberal arts institution. So I'm really excited to be working with the University of Maryland, to be working for Maryland in the public here. Some of my natural resources work and education work as a high school science teacher for a little bit. And I also worked in a lab at a wastewater treatment plant. So I've been sort of jumping around in different fields, but yeah, excited to be in this position to sort of help interpret forests and natural resources to the state, which sort of leads well into the next slide here, just to sort of remind everyone about extension and what that is, because in the months that I've been working in this position, many people do ask, what is extension, or what do people in extension do? So public institutions across the state, some of them are land grant institutions, which means they have land granted to them for the purpose of doing research that benefits the populace, basically people that aren't in college. The quote, takes the university to the people, I think really sort of captures what extension does. So we do research to hopefully improve social, economic, and environmental conditions. And then we also provide non-formal education for stakeholders and residents, which is like this webinar today. Within University of Maryland, there are 4 different types of extension, or 4 different sort of subsects. There's environment and natural resources, which is what I'm a part of. But then there's also agriculture and food systems, family and consumer sciences, and then 4-H, which focuses on youth development and leadership. So there's lots of cross-pollination, but it's a really active group, and yeah, we do a lot to sort of help provide for people across the state. Quick aside about these webinars, you all have probably seen the promotional materials, who knows where, but there are 3 different presentations that I will be giving throughout the fall 2025. So today is the first, and then I'll be doing one in November and in December. So the point of these webinars is to provide forestry and natural resources programming. The position that I'm in has been vacant for a while, so this is sort of a way to introduce myself to the community. Um, I'm also interested in highlighting current relevant research. And then I'd like to use these webinars as a way to determine interests and needs for future programming. So at the end of this talk today, I'll be asking you to provide a quick evaluation of my teaching and what I've done, but then there will be a part that you could add information about any sort of educational or sort of outreach opportunities that you're looking for, that could be in relation to sort of the work that I'm focused on with forestry and natural resources. Okay, so now the housekeeping-ish stuff is out of the way, the introductions. Let's dive into this talk, which is I titled Deep Roots, Understanding Maryland Forests. So there's not going to be any sort of assessment. I won't test you on your knowledge at the end of this, but the key points I wanted to really hammer home throughout this presentation today is to provide a brief history of Maryland's forest land growth and excuse me, from pre-colonial times to today. I'll give a quick overview of the mosaic of forest land across Maryland's landscape, including some information about where forests are and what tree species basically make up the forests. And then I'm going to talk a bit about research that helps us characterize forest and land use. It's really important stuff. I think it's really interesting, and I hope you will too. So to begin, here's a photo of forest land in Maryland. I think it's well timed, just given as fall colors are starting to arrive here in the Mid-Atlantic. This is a stock photo, so I'm not totally sure where this is taken, probably somewhere out in Allegheny or Garrett County. But the point of this photo is to sort of illustrate the point that when you look out into forests across Maryland, when I do, when you're recreating in them, when you're thinking about them, it's really easy to assume that Maryland forests are static. They haven't changed over a long period of time. And that kind of makes sense because trees take a long time to grow. But the fact of the matter is that for a large percentage of Maryland forests, these areas have been cleared, regrown, and manipulated since humans have been a part of the landscape. So forests have gone through periods of dynamic sort of change and regeneration over time. And understanding what land use history has been on the landscape, understanding that history can help us better understand what Maryland might look like in the future. So as we see changes in economies and cultures and climate, we're seeing that, how people have utilized land or drawn on the land in the past could potentially, forecast or help us to think through what our forest land might look like coming down the road here. So to jump right in, I just wanted to give a couple slides to set the stage for the sort of uninitiated in terms of Maryland's place in the world here. So if there are any master gardeners in the call, this map is probably well familiar to you. This is a USDA plant hardiness zone map. This basically identifies areas of the country that it identifies sort of the average lowest temperature of areas in the country. And it basically helps you plan out what types of plants you can put in the ground. The point of showing this map to you is that Maryland is unique in that it sort of is located on this latitude where we have growing zones that are similar in their extreme minimum temperature to states like in New England. You can see parts of Massachusetts and New York State, which debatably isn't New England. Maybe Brad could weigh in on that. Or New Hampshire, that, they have areas that are similar to areas in Western Maryland in terms of their sort of annual cold temperatures. But then we also see areas in Maryland that are more representative or more represented by states like Virginia, North Carolina, and even south of that. So climactically, Maryland kind of exists in this cool zone where some species are at the top of their growing range and others are kind of in the extreme bottom end of their growing range. Additionally, Maryland has different physiographic regions. So this map, this was developed by someone in DNR, but this highlights these different physiographic provinces that exist across the state. So moving left across the map, you can see in Garrett County, Allegheny, Washington, and parts of Frederick County, we have sort of the Mountains Province, which is Appalachian Plateau, Ridge and Valley, Blue Ridge. Moving east, we get into the Piedmont Province, and then finally into the Atlantic Coastal Plain. And why I bring this up is that the geology and the soils of these different provinces are different from one another. And those host different, or those can support different types of tree species. So we have pretty diverse, soils, pretty diverse geography, and then we have variations in climate too, which all leads to, a wide array of forest types that exist across the state. And these forest types are managed differently, given what's growing there and what might ultimately come back. Now, to go back in time to kind of hit this point about Maryland's forest history, we'll talk about Maryland's early forests. And I put early in quotation marks here just to note that this isn't going sort of pre-human era. There's a lot of research that uses pollen records. I mean, it's fascinating. Pollen has this strong shield outside of it that, can be carbon dated way, way pre, people being on the landscape. But we're going to sort of focus in on right around sort of colonial expansion and beyond. But I would be remiss to note that, indigenous communities were a strong part of the landscape before European settlers sort of came into the Chesapeake area. So the map that you see on the slide here was put together by John Smith and colleagues, I suppose. But the map highlights a portion of where Maryland is in the grand scheme of things, and it's hard to see likely on your screen, but the sort of squiggly lines in the different peninsulas along the Chesapeake Bay, those all reference different indigenous communities living in these areas. And so there's a heavy human presence on the landscape, and these communities did utilize forests. It's often assumed this is a map that was made by a forester in the U.S. Forest Service in the 1920s, and you can see that Maryland is completely blacked out, which means that it was assumed it was completely covered by untouched forests. And research is showing that indigenous communities had quite a bit of impact on forests, using areas to clear out for agricultural purposes or using different types of timber products, but not necessarily to the scale and extent as the periods of time that followed. Given that we didn't have cameras or, things to capture images back in those days, we rely on the written word and then again, some sort of archaeological records. What you see on the slide here is a diorama that was put together by a museum attached to the Harvard Forest. And so this museum has a series of land use dioramas attached to them. I'll have a few more photos as the talk goes on today. But they show how forests have changed over time. So you will know that some species, or note that some species in this diorama, like hemlock, isn't necessarily is common down here in Maryland. But the point of why I brought this up is that forests sort of pre-colonial era also were dynamically changed by things like natural disturbances too. You can see sort of young trees in the understory and old trees in the overstory, sort of a diversity of species as well. So theoretically, some of the forests in the Maryland area might have looked somewhat like this, at least in structure, not necessarily types of tree species. Now, this slide I titled Distillation of 2 Centuries. I mean, it's And I had a short PowerPoint. It's hard to sort of condense all of our information into a couple quick slides, but I did want to point out some of the sort of not high points, but some of the dates or times of interest that do correspond with shifts in forest use, especially focused on Maryland in our region. So in 1634, colonists arrived and settled St. Mary's City, where I went to school. Um, and between the 1600s and 1700s, these settlements spread across the Tidewater area, just given that the Chesapeake Bay facilitated trade, and access to the Atlantic Ocean. Um, Heavy land clearing happened in these settlements. Basically, settlers used land clearing to facilitate growing crops like tobacco or other cash crops. The image you see on this is put together from someone at Historic St. Mary's City, sort of re-envisioning or envisioning, I suppose, what the settlement might have looked like uh, in the historic St. Mary's City area. So going back to our diorama and sort of what that land clearing might have looked like, this particular diorama or the slide shows a settler. Again, this would be in New England, but sort of basically establishing a farmstead, a sort of small homestead that they can plant, provide for themselves, but then also potentially make some, money off of. But you can see that what corresponded was really intensive land clearing. What used to be a pretty thick forest is now a fairly large and open field there, with the timber used for things like their homes or firewood, things like that. Moving along to the 1700s and 1800s, we started to see kind of a shift from more individual homestead land clearing to more large tracts of forest land. And these were cut to supply charcoal for iron furnaces. So smelting iron became kind of a big commodity, or that process yielded a commodity iron. And to fuel the furnaces, people needed to supply charcoal. So forest land in Maryland kind of became the prime supplier of certain iron outfits in the state. So some of you might know in Cecil County, the Principio furnace was sort of a major driver of this deforestation and land clearing. The sign says that this furnace or this company made cannons and other ordinances. So, it was a relatively significant provider of iron, products in the area. But what corresponded with that, again, was extremely heavy forest clearing over time. And then, to compound that, we sort of enter into the 1800s, and with the advent of steam engines and railroads, all of a sudden, tracts of timber that weren't necessarily close to, say, Cecil County or maybe Furnace Town down in the southern eastern shore, steam engines and railways sort of connected more disparate areas of forest land to ports. So places like Baltimore were able to sort of receive higher imports in the state, more or less, of wood and wood products. So land clearing reached a high point in the 1800s. And then after the Civil War, many of these homesteads, many of these farm areas were abandoned as people migrated towards city centers and more metropolitan areas. And forests ultimately grew back over time, which kind of led to some of the landscape that we see today. So, I guess the point is, these forests have been going through ebbs and flows across a fairly large period of time. And there were times where there were far less forest on the landscape than there is now. This is a photo from the Forest History Society. They're based in Durham, North Carolina. But this is a photo of forest clearing sort of at its worst. This is down in Louisiana. So again, different types of tree species, clearly different types of topography than what we see in the more mountainous areas of our state. But, we can see with that, this was a photo from the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. So heavy land clearing basically took away all of the seed trees. And so there wasn't any sort of mechanism for future trees to regrow. And so what ended up happening is forested ecosystems, which we think of as, shaded, that has a diverse sort of soil composition and, different types of woody species in the understory. That sort of shifts to a more grassland type environment. Um, and if you know anything about succession, if this was abandoned, theoretically over time, this might regrow back into forest. But we'll talk about that more in the webinar coming up next month. So quick plug for that. But the point is, land clearing it happened on a large scale, and it really impacted sort of what forest composition was around. And it was a lot driven by some of the changes in economies over time. And so we go back to this area of sort of untouched forest across the country, and you can see Maryland, what used to be sort of fully blacked out, was now kind of a piecemeal where much of the forest was taken out across the landscape, with the exception of some forest in the western part of the state. And then going back to our dioramas again, we can see, land clearing at its peak. So if you can think about a photo a couple slides back, the hill in the background was totally forested. And this is sort of an instance or a representation of sort of how widespread that land clearing became, just given personal needs and then more sort of regional economic pull as well. But then I did want to point out in the slide, kind of interestingly, you see some pine start to colonize the one corner of the field there. And as these areas were abandoned, trees began to regrow. So this is an example of white pine sort of coming back on the landscape, and sort of regrowing in areas that were, sort of historically fully cleared out for agricultural purposes. So yeah, pretty cool sort of instances with these dioramas up at that museum. Sort of the last piece of history I did want to note is when conservation sort of became to come into the fray and start to influence policy that shifted forests or protected forest, land in the state and in our region. So in the late 1800s, writing from influential conservationists like George Perkins Marsh, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, they spread and they influenced national and state policies. So you see the advent of national parks, national forest land, and then states adopting some of these policies too. So in 1906, Maryland establishes their first state board of forestry, uh, actually to control wildfires that sprung up from sparks from trains and steam engines, things like that. The photo on the slide here is Fred Besley. He was Maryland's first state forester. And in 1916, he published Maryland's first forest inventory. So he went out by hand and inventoried Maryland's forests. I don't know at what scale, but it was pretty amazing, just sort of the feat that he was able to accomplish. If you're ever interested, that book is available online for free, and it's an interesting read just to sort of see uh, his take on forest land in the state. And then, leading into the 1950s, the Maryland Forest Division began to offer forestry advice and planning to forest landowners. State nursery also was established in that time, I think earlier in the 1900s. But the point is that, sort of this conservation type policy began to take hold, and, Maryland followed suit a bit and was able to sort of uh, protect forests appropriately with the policies that they were trying to adopt. So it's just sort of interesting to see that sort of rapid period of development and expansion and colonization, and then this preservationist, to an extent, or conservationist type ethic began to sort of settle in, and more sustained or sustainable use of forests. You know, a lot of it was informed by science, by forestry schools popping up. This began to sort of spread across the state. Now, okay, so we'll jump another, what, 50 years or so, 60, 70 years to today, and thinking about Maryland's forests today. Now, I did want to make a quick point before I jump into any stats or charts. Operationalizing, which basically means sort of defining forests, is a point of contention for some nerdy people like myself that think about forests most of the time. So I'm going to adopt the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis. It's a group, I'll speak about that more later, but their definition of what a forest is. And their definition states that forest is at least 10% tree canopy cover, at least an acre in size, and at least 120 feet wide when measured stem to stem. So these can be fairly narrow parcels of land, but need to be sort of in some 1 acre. And why this matters is that uh, the Forest Service delineates different land cover and land use types. When thinking about allocating resources, when thinking about making policies, and doing sort of future research. So understanding what forests are and what they aren't can be sort of tricky when you're thinking about land uses like plantations or areas that were recently harvested, for instance. But sort of at the end of the day, forests are considered as, more contiguous tracts of land that really support what we think of as forested ecosystems. Even if there was any sort of harvesting, theoretically that will sort of regenerate back into what we classically think of as a forest. Um, I did want to just point out, I kind of made a simplified graphic of this, delineating between land cover, tree or canopy cover, and then forest cover. So total land cover just encapsulates everything in a parcel or a sort of a geographic piece of land, I guess. So anything in this green oval here would be denoted as total land cover. Forest land cover, if you can kind of follow the dashed lines down in the graphic here, you can see that forest land encapsulates the dead trees, the recently harvested area, and those, living trees there, but it doesn't cover what we see as sort of the orchard on the right side of the graphic. Tree cover or canopy cover just measures sort of how much space a canopy takes up. And so, again, why we're thinking about this and why this is important to think about in Maryland is that there's a lot of tree canopy in the state, but that tree canopy isn't necessarily forest, especially when we're thinking about trees in a street or trees in urban settings that don't have soil, don't have sort of a traditional forest ecosystem underneath of them. Oftentimes, those areas are delineated, excuse me, as tree cover or forest cover comparatively to forest. So, enough in the weeds there. Jumping into Maryland forests today. So there's almost 8 million acres of land in aggregate across the state of Maryland, and about 2.5 million acres of that land is forested, coming out to roughly 36%. These are stats pulled from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Group from the U.S. Forest Service. There's about 2.2 million acres of timberland in that stat. So like think of the 2.5 million acres, the 36%. A fairly close percentage of that is timberland, which means this forest land is able to produce at least 20 cubic feet per acre per year. And all that means is that Maryland's forests are highly productive, and there's a lot of sort of older trees on the landscape that can, provide quite a bit of timber if that was the goal of the state. This map here shows different counties of Maryland. And the darker shading corresponds to areas that have more forest land over other areas. So you can see Garrett County, Allegheny County, Charles County, Wicomico County. These are all areas that are fairly heavily forested, comparatively to more developed counties closer to the DC or Baltimore areas. And again, this is just sort of how forest land differs county by county there. Area of forest land and timberland in Maryland. So I pulled this chart from the technical study on changes in forest cover and tree canopy in Maryland. This is a report authored by several different entities, but it was for the Harry Hughes Center attached to the University of Maryland. But what this chart is showing is sort of the area of forest land and then timberland in the state and how that sort of changed over time, because that's a question that comes up quite a bit. I even saw it in my email today. There's a article in the Bay Journal about, how much forest is or is not in the state and how that has changed over time, especially in more recent years. But what I found striking about this chart is that, from about 2010 on, things have really sort of evened out. And there could be many different explanations for that. That could be we're supplying timber and forest products from other parts of the country and the world. There's less of a demand for any sort of harvesting here on our sort of in our region, our state. And this doesn't necessarily include measurements on canopy cover as well. But the point is that there was a sharp decrease, but then things have sort of evened out when thinking about or looking at trends over a long period of time here. And so this table, I put this together yesterday. Don't get too lost in the weeds, but basically what I wanted to do was compare sort of coverage of forest area in regions of the state from when Fred Besley did his initial inventory to now. And, the inventory steps might have changed. So take these percentages with many grains of salt, but you can see that there are some net increases in forest land from those initial surveys in 1916 to 2023, which is when the most recent FIA data was published. So we see sort of the most loss in southern Maryland, but then higher gains in forest land in western Maryland. So again, keep this in mind. We're talking about an acre that is able, that is 10% covered by trees, that is at least 120 feet from stem to stem. So that rigorous definition of forest land, I think, sort of applies here, especially when thinking about, Besley's inventory as well. But the point is there have been sort of different changes in forest land and coverage across regions of the state. Since we first started really in mass measuring these statistics. Going back to our map of the different physiographic provinces across the state, we can see that forest types differ quite a bit. And so what you could potentially really pull out quickly from this image here, this figure, is that Maryland has a lot of oak trees. Oaks and hickories really dominate the landscape across Maryland. But then we see there are some northern hardwoods mixed in with forests in the western part of the state, and there's quite a significant sort of component of pines, especially loblolly pines, when we get into the coastal plains area, and definitely on the sort of eastern shore of Maryland. So for the uninitiated or for those who aren't super familiar with different forest types, the oak hickory forest, again, is highly prevalent along the state. This is from the DNR's State Wildlife Action Plan. And so I'll kind of gloss through the statement here, but basically, because these forests and forest areas have had, lots of years of human interactions and management and sort of disturbances, you could say. Many of the trees have sort of shifted from being purely oaks and hickories to, there's a lot of tulip poplar or tulip trees, as some people call them, or yellow poplar. There's a heavy component of those trees, as well as sugar maple in areas, white pine, and Virginia pine. This is a photo I took. This is from the Central Maryland Research and Education Center in Clarksville. To those of you who know what barberry looks like, you might cringe at this photo, but the point of this is to show that, tulip poplar has really sort of dominated this area, which is in the Piedmont ecoregion. But, theoretically would be sort of considered within that oak and hickory forest grouping. Northern hardwoods, We saw a lot of those up in New England. Northern hardwoods are often dominated by species like maples and beech, some cherries and birch. Um, Again, these are, more colder growing areas, and there are some pine and potentially hemlock components as well. So this is a photo. It's actually from Vermont, so it's not from here, but there are northern hardwood components as you get further west in the state, and especially as you move up in elevation too. And then oak pine. So uh, there's high levels of red maple and sweet gum, but then we get Virginia pine and loblolly pine. Um, the photo on this slide is from a recent harvest in Dorchester County, Maryland. So you're seeing really strong regeneration of loblolly pine in that photo, but sort of the brushy, taller tree a little bit further back in the background there, that's sweet gum too. So this is kind of characteristic of what types of pine trees grow in that area. And then if you look way in the background, there's a lot of those lighter colored uh, lighter colored bark on the stems, basically the boles of trees in the background. Those are oaks. So anyway, this is sort of more representative of forests as you see on the eastern shore of Maryland. So jumping into research spotlights, and then we can open it up to questions and answers afterwards. So we'll have a little bit of time to discuss. I first wanted to highlight the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. They provide just an immense amount of open source data for researchers to use. I've worked alongside people that are able to sort of take that data and do all sorts of complex modeling and complex sort of forecasting of forests and tracking of forests over time. So this forest inventory and analysis group, they are tasked with doing research on things like a nationwide forest inventory, an urban forest, FIA, which means forest inventory and analysis. Yes, even in urban areas, there are some forested areas. Um, there's a national resource use monitoring component and a national woodland owner survey monitoring component. So I'll go through each and just sort of talk about, um, some of the cool portions of all of these different programs here. So the nationwide forest inventory and urban forest FIA, what you're seeing on the screen here is their sampling approach. So basically, in each state, um, different people are contracted. I believe our state's DNR Forest Services, they work with the National Forest Service to identify different plots and forests around the state. And they do these highly complex, pretty fine-grained, samplings where they go in and they make these different subplots and they measure, different vegetation that's growing on the understory, vegetation that, big trees that are growing in the overstory, and everything in between. So these subplots are then sort of aggregated, and with statistics, we're able to say that with a high degree of certainty, Maryland is 36% forested. Like these sample plots ultimately lead to those statistics that we use in our talks, but then we also use in research as well. Um, I did want to point out how FIA and the Forest Service has, well, all of this is free for anyone to access. And the Forest Service, likely along with other university or other researchers, have built, really cool geospatial tools that can be used using some of this inventory data. So I think Brad might be able to put the link in the chat here, but you can access this website and many others in the Forest Services page, but you can, use tools to understand things like land use change in regions. You can understand sort of land use change within counties. They even, have layers. We're talking about, invaders to forests, sort of non-native pests, things like that. So there's a lot of really interesting applications. I think that's the point of this slide, is to sort of show that beyond some of the raw statistics of what's there and where is it located, these can be or put into a geospatial context, these can be researched and these can be sort of used for more predictive purposes down the road. National, excuse me, resource use monitoring. So this is a tool and this is an area of research that looks at the wood product, sort of the primary processor, what's coming out of the woods in different states across the country, really. So the images that I pulled up on the screen here are two different tools that are associated with the National Resource Use Monitoring output. You can look at the state of Maryland and get a sense of, what timber products are being pulled from the forest, how many timber product processors there are across the state. This is really important when people are thinking about things like doing a timber harvest on their landscape or, doing something on their property. Knowing where markets are can be really important and can really sort of hinder or make sure that responsible management or otherwise can happen in an area. So this entity, I guess is what I'm saying, is that they track this kind of data. They understand to an extent what's coming out of the forests and what is growing sort of in result of. And then the National Woodland Owner Survey. So I'll get into this in a future webinar, but a thriving majority of woodland owners in the state of Maryland are private. So that means these are individuals or families or trusts, not, sort of investment firms and not state or federal. And this is the case more often than not up and down the East Coast of the US. Sorry, Brad probably put the link to the other NRUM in the chat. So he'll probably put the link to this too. But this National Woodland Owner Survey is sent out every several years. I don't know, someone on this call might have received this, but they work to basically help characterize the motivations, the different demographics, the sentiments of people that own forests across the country to, again, sort of help understand what will come out of our forests, what people are even willing to do harvesting on their forests, what kind of outreach should we as extension, as people in the National Forest or State Forest Service, what should we be doing as we interact with forest owners? All of this information sort of comes from this survey. And then again, there's lots of tools and research that has come out based on the findings that are pulled from the survey every few years. Now, one other research highlight, I'm not sure if he's on the call or not. I have a colleague, Luke McCauley, who works with the University of Maryland Extension. And I just wanted to highlight an instance of when someone sort of takes land use data and then applies it in a situation. So I believe they pulled the land use data from other sources. This is, I think, from the Chesapeake Bay program and more sort of geospatial analyses. But he and some graduate students made this recently published a paper about ownership patterns and landscape diversity in the state of Maryland with some cool findings here. And I believe Brad is putting that paper in the chat. This is one of the figures that have come from this paper, and to sort of interpret it, we see that most property owners in the state of Maryland own fairly small parcels of land. The darker colors correspond to smaller parcels of land, whereas the sort of lighter colors leading towards, that yellowy color, those are larger parcels of land, and oftentimes those are more correlated to federal or state owners as well. But the point is that when thinking about how forests are used, how we interact with forests, what changes might happen in the forests down the road. If we know that many of the forests in the state are owned by private entities, and most of these forests are within small parcels, it does have implications on what kind of work can be done before things like property boundaries and legal aspects and all sorts of things kind of come into play. Not to mention sort of the marketability of some of this management as well. One other cool part that I mean, the paper is great, but one other thing I wanted to pull out from the paper was this analysis where they clustered land use type across the state. And so to interpret this really broadly, this figure is showing that people that own property might have a heavy forested component, but they might have other land use types within that parcel as well. So the cluster that says forest on the top left of the screen also shows that, many owners in this cluster also have proportions of wetlands or turf grass or cropland. And so, again, when thinking about forests, it's not sort of this monolith. Forests are really intermixed with other different landscape uh, or ecosystem types or land use types across the state. And we also sort of see that, forest ownerships, people who own forests might range from, just sort of a traditional property owner to a farmer to someone who uses their land for hunting, things like that, but have different features within their landscape as well, and that might impact any sort of willingness to make changes or to manage or to not to develop, to sell their land, things like that. So anyway, this paper sort of gets into the weeds of these ownership types and clusters and land use, changes, but did want to just point this out as a cool way to take some of this high level inventory and statistic data and then put it into a more applied context here. So as I started the presentation, I wanted to make the point clear that Maryland forests have been cleared, regrown, and manipulated since humans have been a part of the land. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just how Maryland has sort of progressed over time, that communities have been interacting with forests, and forests have been responding appropriately. And then we know that land use history and our documentation of that, either historically or sort of statistically, or forecasting out with modeling, things like that, it can really help us better understand what Maryland might look like in the future and how we want to see Maryland look like in the future. So that's what I have for this talk. Because I'm in extension, I really do appreciate any sort of feedback on my teaching. I believe Brad is going to drop in the chat a link to a teaching evaluation, if you would be able to fill that out, and then provide your input on, what kind of programming you might want to see in the future, whether it's more webinars, whether it's a workshop in your county, whether it's, whatever. Please feel free to put that in your evaluation piece. And then I think he's also put Brad, working you to death here. I apologize. He's putting another link on the chat that has the other registration links to the rest of the fall forestry webinar series. These webinars will again progress similar as today, unless I get feedback that says otherwise. But I'll sort of talk through an area of interest, relating to Maryland forests, and then link it to some of the research that's going on that I find interesting and that is sort of pushing this area of knowledge ahead here. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I've seen that some have popped up in the chat potentially, and I don't know if we're able to sort of let people come off mute and talk through a question if they want, but yeah, I really appreciate you tuning in, and happy to answer any questions as they come up.
So Daniel, I could help with that. If first of all, there's 2 or 3 questions that are embedded in the chat, which if you want, I could read out, unless you want to find it yourself.
Great.
I thought you could take a sip for your drink. The second is, if anyone wants to, if it's okay, we have right now the ability to unmute taken off, but if anyone wants to verbally ask a question, Daniel, if this is okay, I would ask you to go into the reaction icon on the bottom and just raise your hand, and then I can unmute that individual. But I've noticed a couple of things in there. I don't know if you noticed it. If you want me to read you one at a time for you to respond, or if you want to go through them, feel free to let me know.
Sure, you can read them off. Yeah, that sounds great.
Sure. So Lynette shares, Baltimore City's trigger for forest designation is much smaller than 1 acre. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. And there are people that are probably much more knowledgeable about this than I am. I know that the Forest Service actually has a unit in Catonsville, I believe. They're looking at urban forest composition in Baltimore. And a lot of awesome studies have come out from that. But to your point, I think it makes sense that in Baltimore, lot sizes are smaller, though there might still be that sort of ecosystem function that's similar to what a forest is. So I don't know what the specific criteria are in terms of size or acreage for Baltimore cities. Um, their delineation of what a forest is, but it definitely makes sense that that kind of hard and fast, here's what a forest is and what it isn't, that sort of definition from the U.S. Forest Service, that might be altered a bit when sort of creeping into more of an urban interface here. I hope that kind of answers the question, but yeah, I think, there's likely information online that I could find or that you could sort of look up that does have more of the specifics on what size limits, excuse me, dictate forests in Baltimore City.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sheila, we'll be coming to you momentarily. Let me just ask these other questions that were already put in to the system, but I'll be unmuting you momentarily. Josette, and if I mispronounced your name, my apology, asked the question, any idea why Garrett County seems to have less forest than Allegheny? I would think the opposite.
Yeah, great question. Your guess is probably as good as mine. My thought is in Allegheny County, well, one, when thinking about how forest cover is measured, again, we're sort of using these point plots. So this isn't perfect. And when we go from forest cover across a state to forest coverage within a county, the the level of standard deviation, the error basically can potentially go up. If we're only measuring a certain amount of plots randomly distributed across Garrett County, there might be a tendency for a lower number than other counties. With that being said, I know that there is Deep Creek Lake, and I know that there is a heavy agricultural component to Garrett County as well. So in terms of, sort of full forest coverage, there might be that, at least that agricultural component that might differ or have lead to differences between the counties. But again, I think there could be a lot of, not a lot of, but there could be some sort of error when thinking about these measurements between counties. I don't want to blame it on that. I'm just thinking that, there could be differences in land use too. So, yeah, that's a great point. Good thing to look up.
Fabulous. Lynette has added some resources regarding the reduced trigger for the Baltimore City forest patches, which are in the chat area if people are interested. It might be related to the question you just answered, but Amelia asks on slide 37, which if you wanted to go back to, I guess you could.
Yeah, sure.
Do you know how that land cover was measured? And again, maybe it was related to what you were just responding to.
37. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So, this researcher, or this group, basically, this was a collaborative between researchers at the University of Maryland and the Geospatial Analysis Lab at the University of Vermont, ironically enough. They used data from the USDA's FIA to write this report. So that land coverage, forest land and timberland, again, came from these kinds of measurements. Go back, these point plots within different forested parcels around the state, and they sort of took that census data and looked at it over time. Um, I'll go back to 37. What we see here is a difference between timberland and forest land. And like I said, timberland is, able to produce a certain amount of cubic acreage or board feet or something of wood products over time, whereas forest land is just kind of that forested area in general. But that I believe was measured, and this data is drawn from the Forest Service's FIA measurements. And I believe the geospatial component looked at canopy cover. So again, the difference between, a forest ecosystem and then trees and a street, more or less, to simplify it, the geospatial data was pulled from, or was used to calculate canopy coverage.
Fantastic. Before we shift over to Sheila for her question, one previous question, Dan asks, does Maryland have any areas of, quote, old growth, unquote, forest?
Yes. So, oh man. Well, maybe if you email me, I'd be happy to send a link to this. So Maryland's Heritage and Wildlife, I believe that's what it's called, they come out with state wildlife action plans every however many years, and they document basically within the state areas of forest types. And within this state wildlife action plan, they sort of point out old growth pockets of different forest types. So that could be, forests. Well, again, like coastal forests, or I'm sort of blanking on northern hardwoods, things like that. This wildlife action plan sort of shows within the state where these older growth pockets are, and if they're available through parks, or if you could sort of access them. I believe they have the information for that. So what I will say, I'll just write in the chat right now, is if you just Google search MD DNR state wildlife action plan. Oh, Charlie, thank you. Yes, that's sort of a great resource to sort of point you to where some of the old growth is.
Fantastic. Sheila, you should be unmuted. Can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
I
We
can, yeah.
can, thanks.
Okay, good. While you were talking, talking about clearing the land, I was wondering if slave labor had a lot to do with the clearing of the land.
Mhm.
And so I, quickly Googled, and it did say that the slave trade was intrinsically linked with forestry and other industries, as enslaved Africans provided the labor to clear forests, harvest timber, and work in agriculture. So I think that may be something that you would at least bring up a little bit in your talk, that this labor for clearing had a lot to do with enslaved Africans. And they also even said in this little piece that I looked at that Harriet Tubman's father, Ben Ross, was they said he worked in timber operations. So they actually speak of people that we know of with some historical value in the Black culture. And so I just wanted to bring that up as a major thing. And when you talk about land, and when you talk about the selling and all these things relative to ownership of land, that ownership of land did not include Black people. So that may be some piece that you can incorporate in your future talks if you decide to ever upgrade your presentation.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that insight, and you're totally right. It's hard work, and I believe it. As you saw, was likely off-sourced to you know to enslaved folks, and I think that yeah, I will absolutely sort of keep that as a component of future talk. So I really appreciate you bringing that up and sharing that insight.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Daniel, I have three more questions if we have time for them.
I'm here. Yep.
All right. And thanks for those who are staying with us. Stacy asks, are pocket forest or microforest recognized by forestry organizations? And what is a pocket forest?
Yeah, great question. So pocket forests, microforests, I forget the Akira. They were basically, the thought of them was established by an architect or landscape architect over in Japan. And some people are planting pocket forests or microforests in urban areas. So I read about one that happened up in New Jersey. Lisa Cooter, who's our native plant specialist with Maryland, is really interested in them too. But the whole point is, it's kind of simple. It's basically to plant as many tree species as you can together in really short or really small, uh, like right next to each other. There's minimal spacing. And so you're sort of emulating a point of natural succession where there's tons of stems together and things begin to outcompete, and then forests grow into different layers. So you'll have, an understory, a midstory, and theoretically an upper canopy. So microforests are just forests really squeezed into tiny urban areas. And theoretically, they offer similar benefits as, a general sort of larger acreage tract of forest would to an extent, some carbon storage or some habitat. Um, in terms of their recognition by forestry organizations, I can't speak to that. I do believe that this is sort of a planting approach that is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. And I think, it's still not necessarily mainstream enough to be recognized as something that could be certified or managed in a way. But I do know that uh, Maryland Department, I think it was MDOT, had a proposal out, for tree planting, and they did mention microforests in it. So I do believe that even within our state, sort of governmental entity level, microforests are on people's radar. So I hope that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Two final questions. Pete shares in slide 38. It only shows us the change in forest land, not timberland.
Yes.
Not sure how slide 38 data would differ were it to include timberland.
Yeah, great question. I'm not sure. Well, so I know that, again, like I said, take these numbers with many grains of salt. The percentages came from Fred Besley's, original forest inventory. And in the book, he doesn't delineate, at least I don't think, between forest land and timberland. So my guess is timberland would probably increase as well, just because we're seeing that forests are aging over time. So their ability to produce, high quantities of timber, basically, or wood, is also increasing. So my guess is that change in forest land is directly sort of followed by changes in timberland too.
Fantastic. And before we come to the final true question, one person asked if the recording, which I know will be made available, will the slides be also made available, or just it's embedded in the recording?
I'll embed the slides in the recording, and then you're welcome to reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to share slides with you. I'm happy to do that, and I'll put
And
my
remind me,
email address in the chat here.
thanks, and remind me again, where I just want to get the URL for where they'll access the recording. That's part of what again now? Where will
It
that
is
be?
the Woodland Stewards. I'm putting it right now. It's
Fantastic.
Maryland Woodland Stewards YouTube channel. And so
I got
what we'll do is we'll start a new playlist, and I will upload this video and then, subsequent videos onto that playlist.
fantastic. And I will you beat me to it. Okay. And then the final question that I have, and first of all, there's a few different folks who have thanked you. Some people have been using in some of their own presentations, I believe. And the final question I have that I captured was, what are some of the effects that global warming is having on Maryland forests? This was asked by Dennis.
Well, likely a lot. I think I'll probably touch more on this in the presentation next month, not next week. I need some time to get that one together. But I think what we're seeing is, prevalence of different forest pests and diseases, becoming more prevalent. I think those are impacting trees because trees become stressed if, their optimal growing range includes a temperature that, or was in a temperature sort of gradient. Whereas if we're getting summers that are much hotter or winters that are much colder, which isn't necessarily happening, but hot summers, dry summers, or really high intensity water, rain events, basically the trees that, inhabited this region prior to that sort of shift in climate or temperature, change, are becoming more stressed. And therefore, diseases and pests and things are able to sort of attack trees more effectively because they're stressed. So that's definitely, one sort of major example there. I think there's also been a lot more invasive species growing in forested areas, potentially again with shifts in climate. Um, yeah, and then I mean, I think the list can go on, but I definitely think because trees are stressed, it's impacting forest's ability to sort of regenerate well. And then the trees that are there are are at risk of becoming more diseased or impacted by pests, things of that nature.
All right, that's what I have. Thank you so much.
Well, great. I guess we're to 8 minutes past time, so I don't know if I should stop recording. But I super